This is the first of two lectures about World War II and the African American experience. The first lecture is going to focus on things that were happening in the military, and the second lecture will focus on things that happened on the home front. Although World War II in Europe began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the United States didn't join the war until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The Axis powers during World War II included Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied powers included Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Now, the reason that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, even though the United States was not at war at that time, was for its embargo of Japan. The United States had put an oil embargo on Japan due to Japan's invasion of China and its attempt to expel Europeans from Asia. All right, so the U.S. enters the conflict as a result of that bombing. There had been, though, since 1939, some feeling that the United States might enter the war because the United States had a historical alliance with Great Britain. President Roosevelt had anticipated the nation's participation in the conflict, and in September 1940, signed into law a peacetime draft. The Selective Service Act required all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register with local draft boards, mobilizing an army of 900,000 soldiers. Roosevelt also prepared the nation for its future role in the conflict by establishing the ideological basis for U.S. intervention in the war. He gave a speech in January 1941 in which he argued that all people had a right to four freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, and interestingly also freedom from want. So some kind of economic subsistence for all inhabitants. In addition to promoting the idea that this war in Europe was about the preservation of these essential freedoms, he met secretly with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a ship in the North Atlantic and signed the Atlantic Charter, which reiterated the four freedoms and also said the United States and Britain in this conflict would be working together to ensure democracy and to make sure that fascism did not prevail. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms Declaration resonated with African Americans who had been fighting racism and fascist-like Southern governments since the days of slavery. African Americans also identified with European Jews who were corralled into ghettos and concentration camps. They interpreted Roosevelt's goals as a call to end racism and fascism at home and abroad. All right, on the lower right-hand side of the slide, you see a drawing of Dory Miller, who was awarded several medals for his bravery during Pearl Harbor. Dory Miller was a messman, that is, he was a cook on board one of the ships, but when the Japanese started to bomb Pearl Harbor, he came up to the top side of the ship and started to load guns and shoot at the Japanese planes. He was shown how to do this by one of his co-workers on board the ship, and so he went above and beyond the call of duty, really rising to the occasion as a wartime hero, and was very much celebrated. Unfortunately, he then did die in combat later in the war. Now, the call to fight in World War II was a little bit troubling to some African Americans because there was discrimination in the armed forces. As I said when we talked about World War I, African Americans were made to fight in segregated units. And in 1938, Charles Hamilton Houston, who you will remember in terms of being the legal mind behind all the challenges of the NAACP in the 1930s, wrote in the New York Times that black soldiers would not be content to act as servants to the Army, quote, in the next war. In September 1940, Walter White, executive secretary of the NAACP, and A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and T. Arnold Hill, advisor on Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration, met with Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Assistant Secretary of War Robert Patterson to demand an end to segregation in the military. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused to integrate the military. He said segregated units had proven satisfactory over a long period of years, and to make changes now would produce a situation destructive to morale and detrimental to the preparations for national defense. The Army did do a couple of things to kind of placate African Americans, which I'll talk about in a moment. Hamilton, Houston, White, and Randolph were not the only ones protesting segregation. Charles Drew, the African-American physician who developed the process of preserving blood, resigned from the Red Cross when it segregated black and white blood reserves. And the NAACP protested the Navy's announcement that it would accept African Americans only as mess attendants, cooks, and stewards, and filed a lawsuit against the Army Air Corps when it refused the application of a Howard University student named Yancey Williams. After refusing to integrate the military, as a symbolic measure, the Army promoted senior black officer Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Sr. to Brigadier General, and the Dean of Howard Law School, Judge William Hastie, was appointed civilian aide on Negro affairs to the Army. But the Roosevelt administration still said black men were not fit to lead and would serve best under the direction of white men, especially white Southern officers. This is a picture of Benjamin O. Davis Sr. from early in his career. He participated in the Spanish-American War and so had been in the military for decades by the time he had been promoted to Brigadier General. A. Philip Randolph called for a march on Washington to protest discrimination in the military. And this was going to be held in January 1941 to pressure the government into ensuring equal opportunity for African Americans and ending discrimination in the Army and defense industry. Roosevelt was afraid of international embarrassment, so he tried to get Randolph to call off the march, but Randolph would not give in. 5 days before the planned march, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industries and created something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission that was supposed to regulate war industries to make sure that African Americans were being hired on the same basis as white workers. Randolph called off the march, thinking, okay, well, Roosevelt is showing his good faith here. I will talk more about war work in Lecture 18. African Americans in general were slow to cast their support for the war and to pledge their loyalty to the war effort. They remembered the racial tensions and violence that followed World War I, and some supported Japan, a nation of people of color, for challenging white supremacy. Even African Americans who opposed Japan's aggression blamed their belligerence on American racism. The black activist and writer George Schuyler said, "Race prejudice and only race prejudice caused our complacence toward Japan." As a result of this, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Division watched African Americans closely. The Japanese had instantiated an intensive propaganda campaign to solicit black people's support, and American protests might have been interpreted as disloyalty and seen as sedition. The fact that the United States detained German, Italian, and Japanese Americans served as a warning to African Americans about the dangers of protest and disloyalty. So all of this is going on. The Black community seems like it's coming under increased scrutiny for its attitude toward the war. So A. Philip Randolph promoted something called the Double V campaign as a way to fight racism while expressing loyalty to the nation and the war effort. He said, African Americans have to simultaneously fight to defeat the Axis powers abroad and to fight for their constitutional rights and freedoms at home. Here is the symbol of the Double V campaign, democracy at home and abroad, of course, V standing for victory. The Black military experience was fraught with violence and discrimination in World War II, just as it had been in World War I. Black draftees were passed over until white soldiers complained that they were the only ones making a blood sacrifice for freedom. Near the war's end, Black inductees steadily increased, but 50 to 75% of them were assigned to non-combat and unskilled work. Only 3 Black divisions saw combat. Officer training, though promising for Black Americans, was also marred by racial discrimination. 20 officer training camps were integrated, and by August 1945, nearly 8,000 Black officers had been commissioned, but they still represented only 1% of Black servicemen, compared to 11% of white servicemen receiving a commission. Black officers were also not allowed to outrank white officers in the same unit, which severely limited their advancement. Black officers could not use white officers' clubs, even though they paid dues for membership. In 1944, the Navy changed its racial practices that excluded Black sailors from significant roles, but still maintained its discrimination practices. So of the 168,000 Black men employed in the Navy by the end of the war, 90% were still messmen. That means they were cooks, they were food servers, they were cleaners, rather than actually being combat fighters. The U.S. Marine Corps did not accept any Black recruits until 1942. Black women were also discriminated against when they attempted to aid the war effort. 4,000 Black women volunteered for the Women's Army Corps, the WACs, but most were assigned to service work that didn't allow them to use the skills that they'd been trained for. Instead, these Black WAC volunteers swept warehouse floors, served food, and did laundry. Only 500 of the 50,000 nurses who served during World War II were Black, and initially they were commissioned to care only for Black soldiers. But since few Black soldiers saw combat and the need for nurses escalated as the war continued, the Army revised this policy in 1944. The Roosevelt administration also banned Black women from the Navy's volunteer unit, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, or WAVES, until the 1944 Republican presidential candidate Thomas Dewey made the ban a campaign issue. At the war's end, there were only 2 Black female officers and 72 Black enlisted women in the Navy, and there were only 4 Black nurses among 11,000 Navy nurses. The United Service Organizations, USO, were the group that coordinated sending celebrities abroad to entertain the troops, and also had kind of dances and other activities for soldiers abroad. But the USO did not cater to Black soldiers. Interesting story here in terms of the picture. These African American women were part of a battalion that was sent to Europe late in the war to deal with the fact that there was a huge backlog of soldier mail. Soldiers moved around a lot. They sometimes couldn't give their forwarding address back to the powers that be, and so there was this huge backlog of letters and packages. And the women who were part of the postal battalion went abroad, and they dealt with all of this mail. They worked in long shifts to try to get it all sorted. And they did this even though Other groups looked down upon them. Some officers, white officers, gave the women a hard time, etc. Here are some African American Army nurses. Black soldiers were the victims of anti-Black violence and harassment. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Black soldiers were forced to ride special buses designated for colored troops. Black soldiers couldn't eat at the bus station restaurants or use facilities that even German prisoners of war could use. Southern towns were especially hostile toward Black soldiers. In 1941, Private Felix Hall of Montgomery, Alabama, was lynched in Fort Benning, Georgia. He was found with his hands and feet bound, hanging inside a ditch. And he had tried with his bound hands to scoop up some dirt and to put it under his feet so that he wouldn't suffocate. And he managed to get a little bit of dirt under his feet, but not enough to save himself. Even though his hands and feet were bound, the War Department would not rule out suicide. In 1942, a Black soldier was killed by a bus driver in Mobile. A police officer clubbed and shot a Black soldier in Beaumont, Texas. And a Black Army nurse in Montgomery was beaten and jailed for defying segregated seating on a bus. In 1943, a white police officer killed a Black soldier in Little Rock, Arkansas. And writer James Baldwin observed that Northern Black families experienced, quote, a peculiar kind of relief when they knew their boys were being shipped out of the South to do battle overseas. So in some ways, being on an army base in the South was more dangerous than being in the European theater of war. To prevent retaliation against this oppression, the governor of Mississippi asked the War Department to move Black regiments out of the state and even requested that the Army remove firing pins from Black soldiers' rifles. The War Department admitted in 1942 that there was a problem. After a violent summer, they issued a memorandum instructing white officers to treat African American soldiers with care and diplomacy. But William Hastie resigned his post as advisor on Negro affairs to Secretary of War Stimson, who Stimson was kind of fond of saying racist things. So Hastie resigned in protest. Hastie was also annoyed that the Army Air Corps refused to deploy the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black flying unit trained at Tuskegee. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they were called, were assigned trash collection and lawn maintenance tasks. And Hastie publicly condemned Stimson's comments about Black inferiority and the War Department's adoption of what he called, quote, the traditional mores of the South. Now, ultimately, towards the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were allowed to go to Europe, where they served as bombing mission escort planes, and they did receive a lot of decorations for their participation in the conflict. Black soldiers who had been sent to North Africa because of an urgent need for combat troops were instead assigned to jobs unloading ships, repairing roads, and driving trucks. One African-American soldier concluded that Blacks were not allowed to fight so that they would not be able to make demands of the nation after the war. Despite all of this oppression and violence and discrimination, many African-American soldiers saw their service as the beginning of the end of segregation. A Black Army corporal explained, I spent 4 years in the Army to free a bunch of Dutchmen and Frenchmen, and I'm hanged if I'm going to let the Alabama version of the Germans kick me around when I get home. I went into the Army an N-word, I'm coming out a man. The 2.5 million African Americans who served in World War II knew that they were going to have to fight for freedom at home as well as abroad. Parenthetically, this was also true of Hispanic veterans, that participation in the conflict galvanized calls for more equal pay, more equal housing. So just as participating in the Civil War really galvanized the Black community to demand, for example, the right to vote, so participation in World War II galvanized the minority communities in demanding civil rights movements. All right, that's it. See you in the comments.